It was a cold, grey morning in the city where tall buildings reached for the clouds, and no one made eye contact long enough to remember another face. And among them all walked Eleanor Hart, the youngest female CEO of a major tech firm in the country. Her heels clicking confidently against the pavement, her eyes fixed straight ahead. As if she could outrun the ghosts of her past, she had everything people envied. From a penthouse apartment to a private car to a bank account that never said no. But what she did not have was something no one could buy: a heart that could still believe in softness, in hope, or in family. It had all been broken a long time ago, when she was only a little girl, and her own mother had walked out the door one night, never to return, leaving her to face years in foster homes, years that taught her never to trust, never to ask for love, and never to expect it from anyone. So Eleanor became everything she once needed: strong, cold, fearless, and unreachable. She had buried her past so deep she no longer felt its weight until that one morning. As she stood waiting for her driver to pull up, she felt a small tug at her sleeve, a small hand barely reaching her elbow, and a soft voice that said, "Miss, I don't have a mama. Can I call you mama just for today?" And when Eleanor looked down, she saw the girl who would change her life forever. She was maybe 5 or 6, wearing a worn-out dress and mismatched shoes, her hair into loose pigtails, and her cheeks flushed with the wind, but her eyes, oh, her eyes were deep wells of something Eleanor recognized too well: loneliness and longing, and a need to be held, to be seen, to be loved. And Eleanor, who had told herself for years that she would never bend, never soften, felt something shift inside her, like ice cracking on a frozen lake. She stared at the girl, unsure whether to scold her, ignore her, or walk away. But before she could speak, the girl added, "Please, Mama, just one day. I miss her, and I don't know what else to do." And Eleanor found herself nodding against every instinct she had, nodding and saying softly, "All right, one day, but just one." She told herself she would take the girl to child services, find her proper help, and that would be the end of it. But life had different plans, because from the moment the little girl slipped her tiny hand into Eleanor's palm, everything Eleanor thought she knew about herself began to unravel. They had breakfast together at a small cafe Eleanor never noticed before, and the girl whose name was Leela told her about how she slept in the shelter, how she used to have a mama who sang her lullabies, and how one day her mama never came back from the hospital, and no one ever explained why. Eleanor listened without asking questions, and instead just watched how Leela used her spoon like it was the fanciest tool on earth, and how she smiled as if pancakes were magic. Eleanor had eaten 100 breakfasts at 5-star hotels, but never once tasted anything like this one. Leela talked about school like it was a dream, and about her stuffed rabbit who'd lost one ear, and about her wish to have a mama who wore nice shoes and smelled like flowers, and held her hand when crossing the street. And Eleanor realized she didn't know what she was doing, but she didn't want to stop doing it at the park. Leela ran up the slides and laughed until she fell backward into Eleanor's arms. And they sat there on a bench for what felt like forever, with Leela resting her head on Eleanor's shoulder like it belonged there, like it had always belonged there. And when it started to snow just a little, Leela whispered, "I knew you were real," and Eleanor said, "Real." And Leela nodded. Mama, from the storybooks you came just when I needed you most, and something inside Eleanor's chest cracked open. So wide she could barely breathe, she took Leela to the children's center as promised. But when they asked her to fill out a report, she couldn't make her hand write her signature. She stood there staring at the form while Leela clung to her leg. And finally Eleanor said, "Is there any way I can keep her just for a little while? Just until we find her family or someone safe?" And the woman behind the desk said, "There's always a way." And so Eleanor took Leela home to her penthouse, which had never once echoed with laughter or tiny feet, and suddenly everything looked different. The couch looked too big and the kitchen too silent, so she let Leela choose a movie, and they watched it together wrapped in a blanket. And Eleanor found herself laughing for the first time in years. And when she tucked Leela into her bed, she stood there watching the girl sleep, and thought, this is dangerous, and yet she couldn't walk away. And when Leela stirred and whispered, "Night, Mama," Eleanor leaned down, kissed her forehead, and whispered back, "Good night, my baby." And from that moment on, there was no turning back. The next morning, sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Eleanor's penthouse, brushing against the silk curtains and waking her slowly in a way she hadn't felt since childhood, when mornings held magic and the world hadn't turned cold and hard. She opened her eyes to an unfamiliar sound, the soft hum of a little girl singing somewhere in the apartment, and at first she thought it was a dream. But then she remembered the small warm hand in hers the night before, and the tiny voice calling her Mama, and suddenly she was out of bed, walking quietly toward the sound. And there in the kitchen, standing on a stool and wearing one of Eleanor's oversized shirts like a dress, was Leela, trying to pour cereal into a glass bowl, her hair a mess, her feet bare, and her face full of joy. Eleanor froze, unable to move, as she watched the child exist so freely in her world, like she belonged there, like she had always belonged there. And when Leela saw her, she beamed and said, "I was making breakfast for us, Mama. I didn't want to wake you." And Eleanor knelt down and took the bowl from her hands before the cereal spilled everywhere and said, "Thank you, baby." And something about saying baby felt so natural, so easy, like her heart had known the word all along. They ate together again, this time in the sunroom Eleanor never used, and Leela talked about wanting to visit the zoo and ride a train and go to school with a pink backpack. And Eleanor found herself nodding to everything, making silent promises she didn't know she could keep. Because her life wasn't built for children, it was built for speed and power and success, and walls thick enough to never hear a cry. But still she took Leela to the zoo that day, and bought her popcorn and cotton candy, and held her hand tightly every time they crossed the path of a crowd. And when Leela screamed with laughter, watching the monkeys, Eleanor laughed too, and people around them smiled at the sight of them. And one woman even said, "Your daughter is adorable," and Eleanor started to say, "She's not mine." But the words caught in her throat, and all she said was, "Thank you." And for that moment it was true. Because Leela was hers, not by blood, but by choice, by need, by something deeper than names and paperwork. They spent the whole day like that, as if the world had paused just for them, as if destiny itself was watching and cheering them on. And when they got home, Leela asked if she could sleep in Eleanor's bed just for tonight, and Eleanor said, "Yes, baby, of course," and they read a book together. And Eleanor found herself doing voices for the characters and laughing when Leela did. And when Leela finally fell asleep with her small arms wrapped around Eleanor's side, Eleanor stared at the ceiling, unable to understand how a little girl had come in and broken down every barrier she had spent years building. By the next week, Eleanor had rearranged meetings, cancelled trips, and for the first time ever told her assistant she needed personal time, something she never allowed before. And her assistant, a kind woman named Nora, who had worked for her for 8 years, looked at her and said, "Is everything okay?" And Eleanor simply replied, "Everything is changing, and I think I need to let it." And Nora smiled and said, "Good, sometimes change is exactly what we need." And so the days passed, and Leela became part of Eleanor's rhythm, brushing her teeth alongside her in the morning, drawing pictures while Eleanor worked from home, and waiting by the window every time Eleanor had to step out. And each time Eleanor returned, Leela ran to her arms and said, "I missed you, Mama." And Eleanor would whisper, "I missed you," to baby more than you know. She bought her clothes, books, toys, and a little backpack that said Leela in bold pink letters. And they started going to the library together, to the park, to the small diner round the corner, where the waitress began calling them her girls and gave Leela extra whipped cream on her cocoa. Everything felt right, so impossibly right that Eleanor began to fear it, because nothing that felt this perfect ever lasted in her life. And sure enough, one morning, she got a call from Child Services. They had found an aunt, a distant relative who lived out of state, someone who claimed Leela as family. And the law was clear, family came first. And Eleanor felt her world collapse the moment she hung up the phone. She didn't know how to explain it to Leela, didn't know how to say, "You can't stay here even though my heart already thinks you're mine." And so she waited, held the truth back, and just watched her little girl play on the floor, surrounded by stuffed animals and coloring books. The next few days were a blur. Eleanor went through the motions, scheduled the visit, made the legal arrangements, and all the while, Leela kept calling her Mama, kept telling her stories, and showing her drawings, and saying, "I love you," as if she knew something was changing, as if she could sense the storm coming. And on the night before Leela was supposed to leave, Eleanor sat beside her on the couch, holding her tightly and whispering, "I don't want to let you go." And Leela looked up at her and said, "But I'll always be your baby, Mama. Even if I'm far away, you can still love me." And Eleanor broke right there, holding the child to her chest, crying the way she hadn't cried in decades. And Leela just wiped her tears and said, "You gave me a mama when I didn't have one, and that means forever." And Eleanor promised herself that night that she would not lose her, she would fight. If there was a way, she would find it, because this little girl had become her heart, her soul, her family, and she was never going back to the life she had before. The morning Leela was supposed to leave arrived with a silence that felt too loud. And Eleanor sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the small pink suitcase by the door, her hands clenched together so tightly her knuckles had turned white, and her heart pounded in her chest like it was trying to run away from the truth. She had done everything she could. The legal team had submitted urgent paperwork. She had pleaded with child services, had offered to foster, even adopt, had made promises, and cried in front of strangers who didn't know how to measure love, only legality and biology. And they had said, "We understand, but the aunt is her blood. She has the right to custody, unless a judge says otherwise, and the hearing would take time, maybe weeks, maybe months." But Leela couldn't stay without a ruling, and Eleanor felt powerless. For the first time in years, she was a woman who built empires, who walked into boardrooms and silenced them with a glance, who negotiated billion-dollar contracts before breakfast. But now she was just a mother who had no voice. When it mattered most, Leela came out of the bathroom in her pajamas, rubbing her eyes. And when she saw Eleanor sitting on the bed, not moving, not speaking, she walked over and crawled into her lap and said, "Mama, are you okay?" And Eleanor wrapped her arms around the small girl and whispered, "No, baby, I'm not okay." And Leela pulled back and said, "Is it because I have to go with the lady?" And Eleanor nodded, unable to speak, and Leela placed her little hand on Eleanor's cheek and said, "But I'll come back, right? Mamas always find their babies." And Eleanor smiled through her tears and said, "Yes, baby, I'll find you no matter where you go." And they got dressed together in silence. And when the social worker arrived with the aunt, a woman who looked tired and uncertain and carried guilt in her eyes, Eleanor watched Leela run to her and hug her politely. But her eyes kept searching for Eleanor, as if asking permission. And when Eleanor nodded, Leela took her new suitcase, but instead of walking out, she turned and ran back, throwing herself into Eleanor's arms and whispered, "I love you, Mama. You're my real one." And Eleanor squeezed her so tightly she thought her heart might burst. She kissed her head and whispered, "I love you, baby, more than anything in the world." And then the girl was gone. The apartment echoed with emptiness, and Eleanor stood in the doorway long after the door had closed, unable to move, unable to breathe. And the days that followed were the darkest Eleanor had ever known. She stopped showing up to meetings, stopped taking calls, barely ate, barely slept. She walked through the apartment like a ghost, touching things Leela had held, replaying her voice in her mind over and over and over again. She tried to focus on the legal case, to be strong, to stay hopeful. But grief was louder than hope, and she missed her baby so badly. It felt like her ribs were cracking from the inside, until one day a small envelope appeared in her mailbox. There was no return address, just her name written in childlike scrawl. And inside was a drawing of two stick figures, holding hands, one tall, one small, both smiling with a sun above them, and at the bottom, in pink crayon, it said, "Me and Mama forever." And Eleanor sank to the floor, holding the paper to her chest, crying so hard she couldn't breathe. But something inside her reignited, and she stood up, wiped her face, and said aloud, "I will bring her home no matter what it takes." And so she fought harder, hired a better attorney, submitted every piece of evidence of love and care and bonding and consistency. She filed for emergency guardianship, submitted character references from her staff, her neighbors, the cafe owner, even the librarian. And when the court date arrived, Eleanor stood tall, dressed not like a CEO, but like a mother, her hair pulled back, a simple blouse, soft eyes, and steady hands. And across the room sat Leela, her small frame in a dress, She didn't like her eyes scanning the room until they landed on Eleanor, and then they lit up. And she whispered Mama so quietly no one else heard, but Eleanor did. And it gave her the strength to speak with conviction, to explain not just facts, but feelings, not just stability, but soul. And when the judge asked her, "Why do you want custody of this child?" Eleanor said, "Because she is mine not by blood, but by heart. Because she found me when I didn't know I was lost, and because I promised her she would never be alone again." And when the judge turned to Leela and asked, "Do you want to stay with Eleanor?" Leela nodded and said, "She's my mama, and that's the only home I want." And days later, when the ruling came and Eleanor was sitting by the window staring into nothing when her phone rang and she answered. And the voice said, "Miss Hart, custody has been awarded in your favor. You may bring Leela home." And Eleanor dropped the phone and cried the kind of cry that holds joy and relief and disbelief and love all at once. And when she pulled up to the small home where Leela had been staying, the girl ran so fast into her arms they almost both fell over. And she kept saying, "Mama, Mama, Mama, I knew you'd come." And Eleanor whispered, "I will always come." And from that day on, the penthouse was never quiet again. It was filled with giggles and bedtime stories and pancakes that were always slightly burnt, and stuffed animals scattered everywhere, and drawings taped to the fridge, and soft little footsteps in the night, and arms around her waist, and a voice that said, "Good night, Mama, I love you." And Eleanor finally understood that life had never truly begun until the day a little girl tugged her sleeve and said, "I don't have a mama, can I call you Mama just for today?" Because sometimes one day is all it takes to change everything, and forever had to start somewhere. Asterisk.